One of the ways that I've seen as someone who counsels pastors or has worked adjacent with them in a variety of contexts is sometimes we're not practicing what we preach. And in a church context, when we look at the pastor as the preacher, sometimes we'll give him a vote of trust or a grade of A if the preaching in the pulpit is, quote, good. But when we look at a whole man, and that's kind of the focus of this devotional, is looking at all these other different areas of life that men sometimes overlook, we have to have our epistemology and our ethics match. So what's being preached in the pulpit needs to be matched at home. So if you're teaching about managing your anger, or teaching parents how to raise their children in the way that they should go, that needs to be reflected at home too for the pastor that's preaching it. So you can't be blowing up on your daughter or getting angry and provoking your children while also teaching a different message.
Well, thank you for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And we are excited about our new space. Now, I want to know, because you probably saw me in another episode with the same outfit on, that we are doing these in bulk. So don't say anything about Lisa wearing the same outfit over and over again. I don't want any judgment. We're doing these in bulk, and I didn't bring multiple outfits for our outfit change this time. But you better know that the next time I probably will change outfits when we do a bulk day. I just want to say that because I am who I am, and people who know me know why that's important. But as I said, I'm Lisa Fields, the founder of the G3 Project, and today I'm joined by another guest, my friend Maliek Blade. You've probably seen Maliek on here a number of times interviewing me when I need to be interviewed for the podcast because I'm a host and I can't interview myself. And so we're thankful to have Maliek here. For those who haven't seen you before, you've been a courageous number of time moderated. You were a panelist the last year. Tell them a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Maliek Blade. Manage a nonprofit called the Whole Brother Mission. We connect Black men in particular with mental health professionals nationwide, uh, all 50 states and DC. And we do that through a variety of means. Sometimes it's just through an insurance handoff. I'm in Texas. I have Blue Cross Blue Shield. Here's someone who takes that insurance. But particularly, we focus in on having therapists that are culturally competent because there is some stigma around Black men seeking mental health services. And then when they actually do reach out, there's some cultural barriers there. And for some people, when they finally do it that first time, and if it's not a good fit, they quit altogether. So we work really hard at connecting men in particular with people that understand them, but also supporting Black families as a whole. So if you are connected to a Black man, sister, brother, wife, we can connect you as well.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I know that a ton of people have taken advantage of the work you're doing, and some have gotten plugged into you through G3. And so we're thankful that God is using you to help people get whole, which is what your new book is about. Can you tell us about this new book?
Yeah, it's called The Whole Man 40 Spiritual Reflections from Black Men on the Head, Heart, Hands, and Soul. So it's a devotional and it has contributions from a variety of different people within the Christian world, Black men in particular. And we're writing to Black men in particular because of some of the unique experiences that they have. So when we look at the whole man, we're thinking about, again, head, heart, hands, and soul. So head is more so mental health, knowledge, education. Heart is emotion. Hands is what you do for vocation, what you do with your time, what you do for ministry. And soul is your faith and salvation. And we believe that if all of those areas are thriving or an optimal area, that is what a whole man looks like. But so often, as we'll get to in this conversation, sometimes we might prioritize one over the other. And when that happens, men aren't thriving in a way that they fully can and in a way that we would say that God has called us to.
Yeah. And so what are the ways in which people prioritize one over the other?
Yeah. So as a seminarian, and just recently, finished forever, never going back to school again. But I
Well, you
finished.
got to the top. You can't
Yeah,
go back.
I
Well,
mean,
you can go
people be doing.
postgraduate.
Yeah, people do
You can
double
get
doctorates.
you can get multiple doctorates.
Yeah, not I. But
Did I
there are
introduce
people.
you as Dr. Maliek
You
Blade?
didn't. I let it go.
I want to give you your new
Yeah, it's
Dr.
cool.
Maliek Blade.
It's cool. We've been friends for years, and I just finished it, so
Yeah.
I don't mind. But yeah, um,
Essentially, you're saying I don't respect my friends that are doctors.
no. I'm saying that you've been calling me Malik for years because I haven't been a
Well,
doctor.
and I mean,
And now,
would I really in any everyday life just be calling you Dr. Maliek
But
Blade?
for the sake of this Jude 3 podcast.
Yes.
But yeah, no, it's cool. But I say that to say, I went to seminary, and one of the things that I noticed is in seminary culture, they kind of deify knowledge. So it's all about what you know. But in a Christian context, we recognize from a holistic perspective, yes, what you know and believe is important, but character, and I would argue your emotional wellness, is very much so important too. What you do is important. But in seminary culture, sometimes the focus just becomes about having right belief. So what happens is you end up having people who believe the right things, who have what some call they're a solid preacher or they have good theology. And while that's one important thing, I've personally witnessed those in ministry, those pastoring, and those in other contexts that don't have the character to match or don't have the emotional maturity to match. And I always think about how the president of my seminary, Danny Aiken, always said, I would rather have you get an A at home and get a C in your class than get a C at home with your family and an A in your class. But again, I've seen much to the contrary of that. So in one way that we kind of deprioritize things that are important is focusing so much on knowledge and having the right information, but deprioritizing things like mental and emotional wellness.
Mm-hmm. No, that's good. I'm in the midst, as you know, I'm in the middle of my second book, which the manuscript is due next week. God help.
Let's make this quick.
When heroes fall. And one of the points I make is that if we aren't whole, the knowledge that we do have will not help us. Because there is a gap oftentimes between what we know in our head and what we know in our heart. There's a quote that I got from this book I read, Green Letters in Seminary. Any truth that we get must go into a battle for us to really believe it. And sometimes when we get knowledge, we think, oh, I believe it. And it's not really till that belief is tested in battle that we know whether we believe it or not. And so, like you're saying, people go to seminary and get a lot of head knowledge, and they equate head knowledge with belief, and that belief they think should transform them. But it hasn't really transformed them because they haven't went through enough experiences to test whether that belief is something they actually have embodied.
And I'm reminded of, while at seminary, they had Dr. Carl Ellis come to preach, and I, at the time, was just kind of like the college student making it through. So I picked him up from the airport, and we had dinner. And I was reminded of how he kind of framed it this way in terms of epistemology and ethics. So epistemology more so meaning right belief, and ethics meaning right behavior, what you do. And in many contexts, we can look at some white evangelical circles where it wasn't balanced. There were what some could consider the good epistemology or the right belief and teaching, but then there are things like slaveholding and things like racism and things like aligning God with political parties and things like that that weren't the right ethics. So we've seen how that's played out in a white context. So I want to bring it home for the whole man, looking at how this looks in a black context. And one of the ways that I've seen as someone who counsels pastors or has worked adjacent with them in a variety of contexts is sometimes we're not practicing what we preach. And in a church context, when we look at the pastor as the preacher, sometimes we'll give him a vote of trust or a grade of A if the preaching in the pulpit is, quote, good. But when we look at a whole man, and that's kind of the focus of this devotional, is looking at all these other different areas of life that men sometimes overlook. We have to have our epistemology and our ethics match. So what's being preached in the pulpit needs to be matched at home. So if you're teaching about managing your anger, or teaching parents how to raise their children in the way that they should go, that needs to be reflected at home too for the pastor that's preaching it. So you can't be blowing up on your daughter, or getting angry and provoking your children while also teaching a different message. So it's important that those things match. And I've just noticed, having been on the preaching circuit and been in the circles for so long, we do a disservice to our churches and our members and our pastors by just allowing their preaching ability to be the litmus test for whether they're doing good or not. And those pastors individually, and all of us as Christians individually need to look at these other areas of life, like our mental and emotional wellness. What am I doing outside of what I do for ministry? What am I doing that is showing that what I'm preaching is true? And lastly, I'll say, one of the major points in my doctoral studies, initially, we started just looking very basically at what is education, what is learning. And the major takeaway from that course was that true learning has not taken place until the information is properly applied. So it's not just regurgitating what I heard, which oftentimes that's the litmus test for preachers, is say the right thing in the pulpit. But this also needs to be applied properly. That's when true learning is taking place.
Yes. Let's move this from just the conversations to how leaders process this to everyday people
Sure.
having incongruence in their life.
Mhm. Sure. So I think immediately was it the Through Eyes of Color conference? It was the first virtual conference I ever did. So thank you for that opportunity. But it was COVID. And one of the things that I was pointing out then is, when we think about how some churches deal with this idea of mental health, I do think we owe a lot of people an apology for how we've handled that. In particular, due to us being spiritually focused, sometimes we overlook certain things like medical. And it's always a contradictory, because when someone at the church is dealing with cancer or high blood pressure, we don't mind sending them to the medical professionals and saying, get that help, take that medication. But there are times where we don't understand when people are dealing with certain medical things as it relates to mental health. And I do think that tension is there because we understand how important the mind, thoughts, and beliefs are. So we want to hold that tightly and make it spiritual. But it's not until someone has a manic episode or psychotic episode that we then punt to the medical professional and say, all right, y'all got to figure that out now. So we have to balance those two things better, but also recognize that people can have difficult experiences in terms of what they think and what they feel. And sometimes in efforts to be helpful, we cause more damage by assuming that it's a spiritual issue, assuming that someone is having this distress because they sinned. So if you stop sinning, if you practice your spiritual disciplines more, this will get fixed. But we don't apply that to other medical issues. So sometimes someone won't be having a difficult experience and they'll feel shunned or condemned because it's being associated with a sinful life or some lack of obedience, when in actuality, it could be depression. And that's not necessarily their fault.
Mhm. No, that's helpful, because that makes me think about, spiritual bypassing.
Hmm.
And for those who don't know what that is, can you just tell our audience what that is?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Um, Even before I think us in a church context would say spiritual bypassing, there was already a term for it from, quote, secular psychology. And it's a type of cognitive distortion, essentially. So cognitive distortions are rigid and tightly held beliefs that we tend to not budge on, but they're actually wrong, but we're holding tightly to them, and it affects how we view others and how we experience others. So one of them is emotional reasoning, leading with how we feel about something, which may not be true in that moment, versus leading with what we do know to be true. And another cognitive distortion is all or nothing thinking. So it's like, prime example, and I'm so glad I can joke about this, but like at the beginning of this interview, you didn't say Dr. Blade. So I could have gotten offended and said, you know what, Lisa hates me. I could have went to that extreme, or it's no big deal, you know. So sometimes all or nothing thinking causes us to go to extremes when it's like, hey, it's not that, and it's not that either. It's somewhere in the middle. So you know, I would say the spiritual bypassing falls under that category that the quote secular psychologists already created, which is kind of like a cognitive distortion where we are, I would say, disconnecting from the reality of what's going on in the natural and focusing on or adding in spiritual elements where that may not be the case. Now, we don't discount spirituality as a whole. We're Christians, we recognize there's a spirit realm, but not every instance that we experience is tied to that.
Mhm. No, that's helpful, and I think, as we're thinking through that and thinking about holistic, when we do apologetics here, anybody who's been following Jude 3 long enough knows that I take a very holistic approach.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna be the classical apologist in my approach because I've noticed over time, which is what my book is about, when they disappoints, a
These
holistic approach.
resources out here.
That there are always usually some emotions at the root of the doubts we
Any
have.
questions? Yeah. And go ahead.
And if we don't get to the root, we'll spend our time arguing with people in conversations that actually get nowhere. And if you actually want transformation for the other person that you have a different perspective then you have to engage what's actually really going on. And often that is missed in the apologetic discipline and other theological disciplines. It is really just, we're going to debate this issue
Right.
when the person's initial issue is usually not their real issue. How have you seen that play out?
Yeah, so it reminds me of again, let's go ahead plug in another resource. So in my first book, Whole Brother, Debunking the Myths That Break the Black Family, it's available on wholebrothermission.com. I had something called the communication pyramid. And it's a perfect example of what you're talking about. And this is going to be helpful, some free couples counseling for those listening. The communication pyramid has these 5 levels. So at the top is cliches. So you have cliches, things like "How you doing? I'm blessed and highly favored." You're just saying the go-to phrase that we throw around. Under that, you have facts. Then you have opinions. Then you have your emotions, how you feel about those things. And then at the very bottom, you have full transparency, sharing all of who you are. And so often in apologetics,
Mhm.
in marriages, people are butting heads because they're coming into the conversation at different levels. So I may just be focused on what are the facts, whereas my wife may be focusing on this is how I feel about it. And
Mhm.
we're clashing because I'm debating about what is factual versus what is not factual. And she wants her feelings to be heard. And neither is invalid. But we have to make sure we're on the same page and having the same conversation. And that has also been seen in the apologetics realm too, where it's like, again, this deification of knowledge. I want to crush you. I want to beat you in terms of this argument. So I'm going to present all the facts that I have. But if the person wasn't so focused on winning the argument and they had some of the people skills and emotional intelligence to recognize, although they may not say it, this person's not trying to uh, attack you by denying the existence of your God, but they have doubts due to a emotional issue or a stressor or a pain point. So if you were less focused on winning and more focused on trying to comfort a hurting person, you could win essentially them over to what you're trying to present. But so often in not understanding those emotional psychological dynamics, we just focus in on the knowledge and not take into consideration the emotional aspect. And again, oftentimes men begin to understand this better when they get married because debating with your wife for 20, 30, 40 years is not practical or helpful. So you have to then open yourself up to them other levels of the communication pyramid. So again, this brings us back to being a holistic man or the man that the moment calls for.
No, that's helpful because when I look at apologetic videos, and I'm sure some of you have seen them, the title will be like uh, "Christian crushes Muslim,"
Oh yeah.
or uh,
Defeats
yeah,
and
and it's like,
yeah,
oh, we're gonna,
destroy.
yeah, we're
It's
gonna
like
battle, and then they have like the
yeah,
hands or like the
got him.
yeah, and
Yeah.
oftentimes, um, while you may be able to overcome them with knowledge or get one up on them, you actually don't win them.
Hmm.
Like they walk away still believing everything they believe
Yeah.
before they came because it's not, if it's, something is a deeply held belief, one argument is not going to untether it.
Right. And I think about it, from a counseling perspective too. Um, if more apologists, evangelists would kind of adopt this, I do think they'd be more successful. Being open to first taking the time to understand why your opponent arrived there. That's it. Before you get to just trying to fight or to scrap or debate, I'm not saying don't contend for truth. I'm not saying that you have to say the truth is relative. Stand on what you believe in. I'm just saying in terms of the successes that we've seen, in some contexts, it'd be beneficial to take the time to understand why that person landed there. In the same way that this works in marriages, my wife's upset with me. Okay, she's upset because I did X, Y, and Z, so I kind of played a part in this. So maybe I should address that first before I get to my. It's the same way from an evangelistic or an apologetics perspective. Is I'm heard better, and this is just again giving you some free jewelry. The way that some people are is their ears don't turn on until you've touched their heart. And that's just the way some people are. And that's not saying that this is going to look like this in every situation, but to be heard, you have to first take an interest in their concern. Then they turn their ears on and can receive what you're saying.
Mhm. And that's why Don't Go, when I think about the series we did, Why Don't Go, where I listened to people who left the faith,
Mhm.
we've had 2 of those. I think we had roundtables discussion maybe with 10 young adults. 2 of those, I don't know the success rate of everyone,
Mhm.
but 2 of those have come back
Right.
and said, "We've reengaged church again." And a part of that was me listening to them,
Mhm.
right?
Yep. Went a
Um
long way.
that the listening went a long way. It wasn't that I answered all their questions perfectly. In some answers, I was like, I think I could have done better at answering the question. But the heart change came because I listened to them.
Mhm.
And when I think about the intersection of therapy and apologetics, many of my friends have said to me that I could be a therapist as another career if I wanted to,
Mhm.
right? Um, because I take an interest in listening, hearing, understanding, and just my interpersonal relationships. And then it's what I do in work is a reflection of what I do in my personal life.
Mhm.
Said that to say, people don't always understand the intersection between therapy and apologetics because as a therapist, you have to sit there and listen to people for a while before you are able to point them to certain truths about them or life.
Mhm.
It takes a while sometimes. So like, a therapist might know something about you when you first walk in the door from one conversation, but they can't tell you that yet because you're not ready to receive it.
Yeah.
Um,
And I can't be so uh personally offended on behalf of Jesus that if someone comes to me doubting God, not believing in God, that I get so riled up that I went, hold on, wait a minute. Jesus Christ is Lord. From a combative perspective, like in that role as a therapist, listening does play a huge part in understanding why people arrive there. And again, I think if we took that approach in other settings, it'd be beneficial. But again, the emotional management piece is sometimes we say that I'm doing this on behalf of the Lord. I'm doing this good work because I'm defending Christianity. And again, we want to encourage contending for the faith. But there is a level to which, again, personal awareness is needed where we can do things that we say are for God, but the motive is impure.
mhm.
The motive may come from a place of insecurity or self-doubt. So even though it looks good on the surface, what is this really about? Prime example, there are so many pastors listening that want their church to grow. They want to have 200, 300, 400, 1,000. They're comparing their church size to other larger churches. Having a big church is cool. A lot of people hearing the gospel is cool, but that may not be what your story is supposed to be. That may not be what God is calling you to. And again, because we look at a big church as a good thing, what are the means that you're going to achieve higher membership? I remember working through this with someone that they did begin to uh, water down their messages because they got a better response rate, a better attendance rate. So yes, high church attendance is a good thing in one sense, but if you're watering down the message to get more numbers, then we've missed the purpose completely.
Yeah.
So it takes self-awareness to recognize, why am I doing what I'm doing? What's the heart behind this? And God is interested in the heart behind what we do, not just what we do.
Yeah. And I think about in the apologetics world, even when we're talking about the videos, about Christian defeats Muslim or
Mm-hmm.
Christian defeats Hebrew Israelite. There's this phrase Walter Kim, my friend Walter Kim, I know you're familiar with Walter, talked about on one episode. There's something another person coined that he talked about: conflict entrepreneurs. And we're living in a world where people make money off of conflict.
Oh yeah.
So if I could talk about something sensational, the views matter. Like, I want people to pay attention to the fact, like, that sometimes people create conflict or a versus perspective because they profit from it. And so not all people that do it, some people profit accidentally.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes along the way, it's hard to know whether I'm still doing this for God or whether I'm doing this for views. And
Mm-hmm.
if I wasn't making thousands of dollars off of a viral video, even though I'm contending for the faith, would I still be doing it?
Right.
If all of my videos are conflict oriented because they get the most views, and the ones that are just sharing truth in a way that is grace and truth doesn't get much play, but the ones where I have the conflict, where I'm on the street and I'm doing this and it's combative, then, and I shift to only doing those because those are the ones that are viewed more, then is this about truth, or this is about the fact that nothing's going to pay me as good
Mm-hmm.
as a seminary graduate?
Right.
Nothing's going to pay me. You can make 6 figures, 7 figures off of YouTube creating conflict and subscribers. And because we live in a culture with the algorithm, it incentivizes people for conflict. And I want to make sure us as Christians, us as apologists, aren't falling victim to that kinds of that way of thinking, because it could be damaging to folks as we're lining our pockets.
And it's so subtle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's real easy to say, well, I'm getting all these views and all these hits and all these subscribers because the Holy Spirit is using me. And no one will really question it. It's like, well, that's a Christian influencer.
Yeah,
They're
and
going
you'll be
viral.
like, you'll justify it by saying,
God is being glorified.
people
You know.
in the comments saying, "Oh, this really changed my life,"
Mhm.
which is deceptive, because I look in the comments of people that I think are false teachers all the time,
And
and
they
they.
do
So
the
I'm
same.
like, I don't think this is a good
Yeah.
measuring
That
rod.
can't be the measure, right? So that's where connection to the Holy Spirit is important,
Mhm.
but also this idea of self-awareness. So that's why we're emphasizing a holistic view of what a healthy man looks like, but also a healthy person. So the Whole Brother Mission is a nonprofit, uh, but we have therapists from a lot of different backgrounds and belief systems. But particularly, we know that there's skepticism within the Christian community around mental health. So in an effort to kind of ease some of that, we do have something called corporate counseling services, where in order to produce this self-awareness that you and I are talking about, so truth, epistemology, and ethics, to achieve that through our corporate counseling services, we're able to avail a portion of our network of therapists that we know are Christians and are vetted to then offer mental health services to a church. So a church may want to offer counseling to their members or to the pastoral leadership or whomever. So we're able to create custom packages to create that access more easily without the worry of, does this therapist have some worldview that we don't want to promote to our, you already have Christians that are vetted to balance psychology with the word of God, uh, to ultimately produce this self-awareness that we're talking about. Because again, I do think in some cases, again, in a church context, if we're just so focused on the spiritual, um, I've seen it time and time again where things unfold. And while we were so focused on the spiritual or the preaching or just articulating the right points, that um, things unfold and they get really ugly. Uh, can we talk about your next book, or how much can I say? Because I was just about to say so, and I was like, well, I know what's going on with that book, but am I?
I mean, as long as you don't use names, because I'm not used to
No,
names.
no, 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 not names, not names, but the idea of leaders and heroes falling. And when that comes up, so often we begin to piece back through it, such and such spell. And it's like, well, such and such preached this and said this, but when the exposure or the fall happens, we recognize all these other areas of life that we didn't think mattered, or people weren't looking at, or people assumed were intact because the preaching or teaching was right. So I would also say it's important for us to have this balance so that we're not picking up the pieces after the fact. And if we had more balanced conversations in terms of wedding the two, we could prevent some of those pastoral fallings or layperson fallings, or even, the rise or the stories that we've seen of pastoral suicide. Taking a second look at what good or doing well is beyond how someone presents or performs is going to be really important for us.
Yeah. I think that that is key. Like, as I've engaged with people, that I've been impressed with in the initial conversation.
Hmm.
Like, oh, they're solid because they know these things. And then you start pulling back the layers and you realize,
Oh,
oh,
yeah.
it's a lot of childhood trauma you haven't processed,
Hmm.
but you know how to communicate. And that becomes damaging. And so somebody sees them and they're like, man, this person is theologically sound. And people that know them are like, yeah, but they're not
Kind.
kind or they're just not well
Mhm.
emotionally. And so they don't dig any deeper because their litmus test was only, do you know these doctrines? Can you
Right.
quote these verses? And they don't go dig deeper to pull back the curtains. Or
Mhm.
they're like, oh man, this person has a radical testimony. They were out here wilding and God set them free. And now
Mhm.
they're just a born again Christian telling everybody about Jesus. And while that is true, there is still trauma that will rear its ugly head, even if they're able to make that radical flip just on the things they used to do. If they were on drugs, they're not on drugs anymore. All that, and then we think, oh, they're good. And then you like peel back and have relationships or have triggers happen, and you realize, oh, this person is not well.
Right. Right. Yeah. And so often I do think we forget that it's important to have someone to walk with leaders too. Often the focus becomes on the discipleship of the members, but pastors and leaders are still humans too, and they go through things, and so often they don't. Unfortunately, I've seen it time and time again. They don't have the support, and even more so, my brother Jerome Gay released a book called Church Hurt, um, and he talked about this idea of not just pastors not leading well and hurting members, but also the opposite of that, where members are hurtful to the pastor or the families. And I think one of the ways we do that is by pushing them. I think an artist like Kanye West, who's dealing with bipolar disorder, but people just want another album. They
Mm.
want a tour, perform, go, 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 go. We see that in a secular context and we think, oh, that's not right. That's not good. But in many ways, churches function in the same way. We want more. Give us more. Give us more. and this person's dying right in front of us, and no one's taking the time to check a pulse, to check in on how you're doing. So it goes both ways. And again, this more balanced, holistic perspective will be beneficial for all of us. But it requires us to take the time to stop for a moment and even stop with productivity. So even productivity in terms of ministry or another service or another outreach or another conference. Um, God shows up through those things, but God also shows up in our moments of silence and solitude as well. I'm sure many of us have come across moments where the most spiritual and obedient to God thing is to not do another thing. And I can speak for this as men. So often our identity is tied to productivity before becoming Christians. And then that still sticks with us even after we come to faith. So we're still trying to prove value by how many people I can win to Christ, how big is my church, how many people are downloading my sermons, how many books did I sell? And especially in this influencer pastor culture, we're gauging our value. We'll definitely say from the pulpit, we're not saved by good works.
Mm-hmm.
And then we overcommit ourselves to all these good works. So again, it goes back to what is motivating you? Why are you doing this? And is this healthy?
Yeah. What you're talking to make me think about the late Zachary Timms, and he was a pastor in Orlando mega church, and he ended up passing away of an apparent drug overdose, allegedly in a hotel room in New York City. And I remember his ex-wife was doing an interview, and she said that when he fell, which was the cause of their divorce, he had an affair, that the church members wanted him back.
Mm-hmm.
She said, I wonder if his life would have ended differently if they gave him the time he needed to heal.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if our family would have actually made it if he didn't rush back
Right.
in the pulpit, because they were like, oh, God forgives you. We forgive you. We want you back. 3 months is, I mean, he took 3 months, but they were like, come back. And because obviously unhealth in him, he rushed back and he prioritized getting back over prioritized trying to fix his family. And that led him to losing his family. And that also led him to his untimely death.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we think, man, we just want to restore people. And I talk about in the book, restoration is not about restoring people to a position, but restoring them to a path. So if they were your pastor, or if they were your spiritual leader, or if they were your coach and mentor, because of their indiscretion, the position may not be healthy for them.
Mm-hmm.
But restoration is not about getting them back into the position they once held,
Mm-hmm.
because it might not be safe for other people.
Right.
It might not be healthy for them. It's about getting them back on the right path in their relationship with God, the right path as it relates to their emotions and holistic health. And if we don't see restoration as about getting people on the right path, and we only think it's about putting people in the right position, people won't get healthy, and their restoration process won't actually help them to be restored.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And even in terms of that restoration, I do think in a pastoral context, a lot of times the assumption is restoration means he gets to preach again. That's all we're thinking about is can he preach again?
Yeah, not
And it doesn't always look like that.
Yeah.
And sometimes restoration is never being over
Other
certain
people.
people or things again.
Yeah.
And it's ultimately at the core going to be about being restored to God
Mhm.
first.
Yeah.
So that's something that ultimately has to be discerned.
Mhm.
But again, with lacking the self-awareness, with lacking the emotional intelligence or not taking the time, we don't, in some cases, I found we don't seek God on that. We already have an ideal of what we want to get back to. We had this bump in the road. You had an affair. Okay, cool. And the focus ends up being more so damage control to say we did something. Church is functioning like a business, good PR, but again, not looking at the whole person.
Mhm.
It's one thing if Apple, a district manager at Apple got caught up in some stuff, and HR want to make sure this don't ruin the whole company. That's one thing, but our churches shouldn't be functioning like that. But in many ways, we still do. We're trying to protect the business rather than looking at the wholeness and the wellness of the individual.
Well, this has been a great conversation. What else would you want to say about the whole man? Make sure y'all get this so you can become. Make sure y'all get this so you can become a whole person. And I think even if you're not a man, that if you read this, you could take some tools from this to apply to your life to become a whole person. So what would you?
Yeah, I would definitely say I think the tools overall are things that are going to be beneficial for a lot of people as a whole. We zoomed in on Black men in particular because, in one sense, a lot of times we don't get stuff. You know, there's a lot of stuff for the women's conferences, women this, women that, and the man is like, get out there and preach. So we wanted to, prioritize the brothers in that way. But I would say, you'll notice this devotional is different from your average devotional. It's in partnership with Our Daily Bread Ministries, but it's not your average devotional. After you begin to read and you see the different places that we go, um, I think each one, and as a general editor, I reviewed all of them. There's devotionals that are like, that was cute, that was nice little picker upper as I drink my coffee. But I do think we go a bit deeper, and that's needed because, again, the picker upper might not deal with the complexities of what the man is experiencing. So I would say, go into this with an open mind, recognizing that maybe the standard of good or successful may have not been as thoroughly thought through as it could have been. So be open to a new standard or idea of what good, doing well, or healthy is for you as a man, as a father, as a pastor. And we want to kind of challenge that and spur us forward to have a more robust and in-depth view on that. And again, it's available, on Amazon and places like that, but those places are so stingy, I must say. So if you are interested in getting it, please consider getting it directly from us at wholebrothermission.com.
And how can people find you on social media?
Yeah, at Whole Brother Mission on Instagram. I was about to say TikTok, but it was gone, but it's back now. So you can still go to TikTok, and Twitch too. So we recently relaunched our podcast as well. And in light of kind of the changing demographics online, we stream live every Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So at Whole Brother Live on Twitch, we're live. And then the podcast, after it goes live, it's available on the podcast channels like Apple Podcasts, Spotify. But all this is available to you at wholebrothermission.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Maliek. This has been a rich conversation. And thank y'all for tuning in to another episode of the Jude 3 Project Podcast. Remember, my book, When Faith Disappoints, is out, available now wherever books are sold. You can get all our resources, our curriculum, online courses, listen to past podcasts, watch our documentaries, all available links to those at jude3project.org. Wherever you stream or listen to this podcast, subscribe, give us a comment. It really helps us. If you're watching this on YouTube, like and subscribe. And remember to do what we do with the Jude 3 Project, whether it's the work we're doing on college campuses, whether it was the work we're doing around the country at churches. We cannot do what we do without the generous support of people like you. Every gift helps equip. So consider becoming a monthly partner or a one-time giver. Doing so at jude3project.org/donate. There's also a tab if you hit donate on our website that gives you an address if you want to mail in the gift, or you could just give online. As I always say, every gift helps equip. Until next time, grace and peace, and God bless.